Welcome to Tone Talks. What up, y'all? This is Antonio Moore coming to you from Tone Talks. I have the wonderful presidential candidate Marianne Williamson in the studio today at Dash Radio. I promised y'all we would have this today. I also have Yvette Carnell from Breaking Brown. As you guys know, we're looking to have a powerful discussion, a discussion that brings politics, black politics to the table, American politics to the table, ADOS politics to the table. You want to say hello to the audience?
Thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be here.
Oh man, we're glad to have you as well. Yvette, you want to say hello as well?
I want to say hey and thank you for doing this, Ms. Williamson. We really appreciate you coming by and having this conversation.
Thank you very, very much.
I really appreciate you as well. You know, we had to get this going. She was in Los Angeles and she opened her arms and allowed us to have this discussion on such short notice. But we're going to make sure we dig into it today and we have a wonderful discussion around everything that's going on. I know everybody saw the Washington Post article, you've seen the Intercept article, you've seen the Philly.com article. We're having a discussion not just about reparations, but about American politics. You want to tell everybody a little bit about your campaign before I get into my questions?
Well, I'm running for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 2020. People can look at my website, marianne2020.com, for my stance on all of the issues. I am a progressive Democrat, but I'm talking about what I think of as the deeper healing that is necessary. I think that the conversation that dominates most establishment politics, even on the left and even in the Democratic Party, is too superficial. It's too shallow to be the container that we need in order to move this country forward. I think in order to really navigate the times in which we live and to transform them, which is ultimately the point, we need to dig deeper into the psychological and emotional and spiritual and moral realities that underlie not only the forces that brought us to where we are, but the forces that need to be addressed in order to move us forward. So I think just like we have holistic health, we need a holistic politics. We need to talk about more than the symptoms. We need to talk about the causes of our deep diseases.
I agree. I mean, I've watched a couple discussions with you, and I have to say we've seen powerful things coming out of you. One of the things that brought you to the table in such a big way for Black America, of course, was that you started off your campaign announcing that we needed to deal with reparations. Now, we'll deal in the second question with the amount, but I asked you today, I guess, you decided to run for president by announcing you were for slavery reparations, for American DOS, for American descendants of slavery. Why? Why that? Why did you start there?
My career for the last 35 years has been a field of transformation. And the same psychological and emotional and spiritual forces that prevail within the journey of an individual prevail within the journey of a nation, because all that a country is a group of individuals. So if you really want to change your life, you need to get straight with God. You need to really address in a very honest and self-aware way where you're not who you might say you are, where you have character defects. And I think Catholic going to confession, or a Jew on Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, which is the holiest day of the year, or in recovery, for instance, 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, where you have to take a serious moral inventory and admit your character defects and atone for them and make amends. I think that's true for our nation as well. And I had read a proclamation by Abraham Lincoln in 1864, where he said that a nation must confess its sins. So I think clearly racism is a national character defect that has been with us since the beginning. And I am a student of history, and I believe that when it comes to race in America, and I think that this is significant for me, I don't think the average American is a racist, but I do think the average American is woefully undereducated about the history of race in America. And so much has been done, but much remains to be done. Much even that has been done is now coming undone. And it's time for our generation to write our chapter and do the next big thing, the next major piece that has to do with economic restitution that was never fully addressed in the past.
I totally understand. I mean, we here at the Tone Talks audience understand that the middle Black family in this country is worth $1,700 without depreciating the assets. half of Black America combined is worth less than $1. This is all Federal Reserve numbers. Only a few 100,000 Black families even break $1 million, while 13 million white families are above $1 million. So the reality of the disparate spread of wealth between Blacks and whites is more than a problem. It's actually shut Black people out, ADOS people out of America. Yvette, any question you want to ask before I go into the second part?
No, go into the second part and I'll chime in there.
So let me ask you, I guess when you announced the net, you said the amount of $100 billion. You know, since then, I believe William Darity, professor, has talked to you. Where did that number come from? And do you understand that number is entirely too low?
Yeah, I first started talking about reparations for slavery in a book I wrote in 1997. But at that time, I didn't say anything about numbers. And then when I first wrote an article about it, it's interesting because I see my own process and it's very, I learned from it. So when I first wrote about this, I said 500 billion. And then I got scared and I backed away from that. And I said, well, nobody will take me seriously, so I'll say 200 billion. And then when I spoke about it once publicly, I said, well, anything less than $1 billion would be an insult. And then I just stayed with that number. And I should have realized, once you're talking as someone seeking a nomination for president, you need to be very, very careful with your numbers. And I can see clearly that I wasn't. I knew that under 100 billion was an insult. That much I knew. But I certainly see that it's interesting to me because I think it's interesting that I originally wrote 5 and then went to 2 and then went to 1.
Yes, but and so
scurried away from it.
And so when we look at this from the standpoint of academics, William Darity, he has the great paper, 40 Acres and a Mule in the 21st Century. You start to understand that this is a multi-trillion-dollar investment.
If you were, first of all, we can't put a dollar, when you're talking about lives of people. But at the same time, I read a book once that said something very interesting. It said, with philosophy, you must never compromise. No, he said, with vision, you must never compromise. With politics is the art of compromise. So I certainly, in any kind of a deal, there's negotiation. And I feel that my part, the part that I am seeking to play as a candidate and that I would seek to play as president, has to do with building the case and building the consensus that a wrong must be righted and that America will not move forward in the ways we would wish to move forward until we do this, not only in honor of our ancestors, but in service to our descendants. That is the part that I feel, that's my piece. And if I'm honored enough to be president, then we sit down. And I think clearly the issue is not only what should be done, but what can be done. And I also understand, I've heard people such as Professor Darity, it was a conversation with him. I don't know if he was the one who said it. It might have been the other man on the phone. But I understand the point of Black leaders saying, well, but if it's too small an amount, then it could possibly do us more harm than good.
Yeah.
I understand that, actually.
I think you're going to get one shot at this thing. And you can't be scared to actually make the claim for what it actually is. We ourselves, ADOS101.com, have full agenda because it's not just money. It's a number of other type of programs, infrastructure, things of the sort. Before I get into the new Washington Post article that just came out today, Yvette, you want to add any questions to those 2 points?
Well, I have a question. And I actually, right after college, Ms. Williams, I read your first book, Return to Love. And one of the things that you kind of said is every step that you take is a step toward love or a step toward fear. So it's kind of interesting when you say that you kind of stepped away from that.
Yeah, in
kind
fear,
of,
exactly.
You back to that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and so the question that I have in terms of you're entering this realm of politics and there are structures. There are democratic structures. There are machine politics that you're entering into. And you mentioned like Abraham Lincoln, and I think, Martin Luther King Jr. would kind of be in this stead. And I'm wondering, in terms of how you position yourself, in terms of what your philosophy is, in terms of, the spiritual framework, in terms of the redress and that sort of thing, how do you kind of how do you navigate this sort of where if you're going to do advocacy, because Lincoln was assassinated, MLK was assassinated. Like if you're going to do advocacy that includes descendants of slaves, you're going to have people come at you in a very real world kind of way. And how do you maintain what you have as your value set in that world of politics?
Well, physical survival is no guarantee for anyone. It's no guarantee that you won't be killed in a car accident this afternoon. And I'm in a public career, and anybody who is a public orator or anybody who stands on stage and does anything understands that they're a clear shot for someone in the audience. That's just true no matter what you're doing. And at a certain point in life, you can't be guided by that. But I already have a career for 35 years where I say what I believe is the truth that needs to be said. Now, I believe, and I've mentioned this a lot recently, every time I mention the topic of reparations for slavery, which is only one of the things that I talk about, but on that particular topic, I get applause every time I bring it up. I was in Exeter, New Hampshire the other day. New Hampshire is one of the whitest states in America. I get applause. Iowa, one of the whitest states in America. I get applause. Even when I'm talking to all white audiences in South Carolina, I get applause. This is how I feel. I feel the American people are good people. We don't have a political force field at this time which seeks to tap into the goodness of people. It seeks to tap into the selfishness of people, the entitlement of people, the self-centeredness of people. And of course, on the other side, we have a president who's harnessed the fear in people, some of the worst aspects of the American character for political purposes. We have done the right thing before. I mean, this country did ultimately support civil rights legislation. This country did support the women's suffrage movement. I don't think it's reasonable to just assume that if people were given the opportunity to do the right thing within a context of explanation, that's the thing, as I said before, I don't think the average person, and this is because, 11 states in this country don't even require half a year of American history and civics. And even those that do, look at an American history book and you look at what's in there about the 100 years between the end of slavery and the civil rights legislation. I think the average American does not know the whole arc of our history. And not only do they not know the facts, and this is another thing that I'm seeking to do with my candidacy that I would hope to do as president, we need a much wider humanity, breadth of our humanity brought into our consideration of political subjects. I don't think, we're a country which is young, and a country which is optimistic, or certainly has been. And so we are not a country that has included in our political conversation sometimes the depth of human emotion that stems from a deep understanding of certain historical realities. And I don't think the average person is bad. I think the average American hasn't really sat and thought about what 2.5 centuries of slavery meant.
See, and I guess I come to additional point to that, and thinking about things in terms of good and bad. I more so think of things in terms of the average person self-interested. And when we look at this nation, as I was sharing with you, there are more black men incarcerated than pretty much all women on the planet. There's 4 billion women, about 700,000 are incarcerated. The large sum being in America, 200,000 of that 700,000 being American women. But just 20 million black males produce 700,000 prisoners. And so I asked the question, if your life sits upon that today, does that say that you really, really don't too much care about race? And so now when I introduce reparations, you don't think about it in terms of good and bad. You just think about it in terms of, I need a job, I need my kids to be fed.
The part of the brain that rationally analyzes an issue is not the same part of the brain that decides who to vote for. the part of the brain that rationally analyzes an issue is not necessarily the part of the brain that receives it on the level that we need it received. And that's what I meant by the actual bearing witness to the agony, which is not, you can say all the facts that you want, and I remind you that's not working. But when someone opens up, which is not an easy thing to do if you're not used to it, to the emotional and human, the pure human reality of 2.5 centuries of slavery, followed by, and this is where, and I'm telling you, this is my experience talking to white audiences. So many white audiences, when I talk about the Black Code laws, when I talk about the 100 years, when I talk about the 40 acres and a mule, when I talk about the Ku Klux Klan, when I talk about the lynchings, when I talk about then what happened full-on white supremacy and segregation at night by 1900, when I talk about the fact that it took 100 years before this was fundamentally addressed, that was another phase of violence. People look at me, it's like no one had sort of presented it for them in the way they might have. I remember when the movie Schindler's List came out. I didn't really want to see it because I knew it was going to be difficult. But I also knew that I had to, that it was morally incorrect of me to look away. And I think that in America, we've developed this society where you just throw this cheap yellow happy face, happy, let's all be happy. Well, some things are actually not very happy.
So let me ask you just straight. If white America understands reparations as a restructuring, and when I say a restructuring, I'm not even thinking in terms of money, meaning you can't be white anymore. We got to just all be people. Do you think white America is ready to accept that?
White America is not a monolith. No, white America is not a monolith. Neither is Black America, for that matter. But I don't think, I think we need to move beyond the concept of traditional strategizing into the awareness that there is a quantum field of infinite possibility that arises out of love. So the majority didn't wake up one day and say, let's free the slaves. And the majority didn't wake up one day and say, let's give women the right to vote. And the majority didn't wake up one day and say, let's dismantle segregation. Those who believed in it strongly and whose hearts were ablaze with what those things represented in terms of doing the right thing stood deeply on what they believed, and that conviction became a force multiplier. This whole idea of how you're going to navigate and who you're going to convince, my career so far, things have worked pretty well for me. Simply saying, what would love do? And I've seen in my life, and I've seen what has happened in so many people's lives around me, that when you ask what would love do, that means you have to recognize when there is a debt to be paid, when there is a defect of character. And I think that when you lay out the story in a certain way, it is my experience with white audiences that when you lay out the story in a certain way, people go, yeah, that makes sense. I'm not lying to you when I tell you I get applause every time.
Yvette, anything you want to add to that?
Well, one of the things in terms of, we provide the context. We're talking about Trump's America, right? In the sense of we saw the people in Charlottesville. We've seen like this uptick in racism and racist rhetoric and things that we didn't really anticipate seeing in 2019. So I definitely understand what you're saying in terms of, what would love do. But in the political arena, and I understand your idea not to like navigate that in a traditional political style. But what I would say is, don't you have to ask yourself, like, what do you do in the face of that kind of hatred that wants to kind of skip by and skip past the suffering of descendants of slaves? Doesn't that has to be a meeting of the minds in a sense, in terms of like, the Bible says I'm in this world, but I'm not of it. You got to be in it too, right?
Well, I feel I'm very in it, and running for president is very in it. Those men walking, and some women on the streets of Charlottesville, they were saying, Jews shall not replace us. These were Nazis. They were after the Jews. So it was not just racist. It was also severely anti-Semitic. Jews shall not replace us. Jews shall not replace us. So I'm very aware. I'm very aware as a Jew. And I'm very aware that this is not a small danger. And I'm very aware that steps must be taken. But that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. So when I say that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, I believe we need to harness love for political purposes. I'm not just having a philosophical conversation, remember, I'm running for president. And for that very reason, Trump has harnessed fear for political purposes. We must harness love for political purposes. Nazis and racists and anti-Semites and homophobes and Islamophobes, they're like an opportunistic infection. The problem is that we have a weakened immune system. I saw online the other day, or yesterday or something, that Louis Pasteur, the great scientist, on his deathbed said, I was wrong. It's not the germ, it's the terrain. So that's exactly what I'm talking about here. We need to have such an uprising of our moral conviction, without which no amount of political strategizing, without which no amount of political, the normal, what we think of, is going to be strong enough. You can't defeat those kinds of dog whistles. You have to drown them out with angel voices. And angel voices emanate not from people who are just angry or having an intellectual or an economic conversation. Angel voices means the power not only of our voices but of our spirits when we're coming from a place of love.
So let me ask you this too, Ben. We live in a time where wealth has calcified to the point of something we haven't seen since the Depression. Top 0.1% has the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90. We haven't seen that since the Depression. What I come to you with then is, can angel voices be enough in an America where white America is Ubering as well, Uber driving, where white America feels like they don't have enough as well and they're underwater in their homes? Do people need to be comfortable to actually hear these voices?
This is why this is such an urgent moment. That's why. Because large groups of desperate people are a security risk. Desperate people do desperate things. Desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. I don't think Trump would be president had there not been so many millions of chronically economically desperate people. What we have on our hands now is a situation, even since he's been president, the 2017 tax bill, where $2 trillion, that 83 cents of every dollar goes to the top, plus you have this extraordinary wave of automation that's going to come at us like a tsunami of job destruction over the next 15 years. This is why I'm doing this. We need a miracle. We need something that comes from a quantum field of endless possibility, and which we know does occur every time in history it has been promulgated. That's what Martin Luther King brought forth. That's what Gandhi brought forth. Traditional, that's kind of my point. You're actually proving my point. What we're working with now is not strong enough. Traditional politics is not strong enough to override such a nefarious force as is working against our democracy right now.
So look, it's actually interesting because this leads me right into the Washington Post article that came out today.
Wait, what you're talking about the Washington Post today? You mean the thing that
the one that talked about reparations, and no Democratic candidate really has a plan. Oh. Everybody's agreed to reparations. Kamala Harris on the Breakfast Club was loosely asked about reparations.
But you know what's going on there.
What's going on?
Well, what's going on is that we brought it up.
Yes.
And so that's caused some problems for her.
Yes.
And for Elizabeth. And so that's how the status quo does. The status quo protects itself by co-opting disruptive language. So now your traditional candidates will say things like a path that leads to reparations or race-conscious policies. It's always a path that leads to universal health care or a path that leads to reparations. Is the status quo saying what it thinks it needs to say in order to get away with not doing it.
I have to agree with that part. Because I when I look at what Kamala Harris talks about, the LIFT program, I don't understand how that fixes the dire state of black families across this country.
It doesn't.
And then in addition, I don't understand how someone who actually instituted a truancy problem that put people in basically in prison for poverty and not sending their kids to school, institutes that as well.
And you should also ask about why the one person running for president who has talked about this as a specific plan is left out of such articles and shut out of the mainstream press.
We're talking about you, right?
I sure am.
Do you feel shut out from the mainstream press?
I think it's very obvious that when you have even a topic such as you just mentioned, and I'm the one candidate who's actually brought forth a plan, that instead of actually talking about me and anything other than describing me as long shot, which of course then makes you a long shot, or minimizing what you're saying, it's obvious. And I don't want to come across like whiny or poor me, but this is much bigger than just about me. It's how the status quo protects itself.
Yvette, anything you want to add to that?
No, I do agree. I agree with her there, though. I think this is how the status quo protects itself. And I think because of that, what you're looking at is something that's going to require, a lot of work in terms of something that she said before. Because there's something that Ms. Williamson said before that I haven't heard from a lot of people. Right? You hear a lot. We've heard Elizabeth Warren talk about. She came out talking about redlining. Now you have Kamala Harris talking about loosely, like you said, reparations. And one of the things that really struck me in a different interview that I would like to hear you talk more about is you talk about, like, these are not just people. What happens in terms of Black American ADOS people is we are victimized by systems and how to change those systems. And I would like to hear you speak more specifically about those systems. And like, if you were elected president, what steps would you, initially, I'm not talking about, the most intricate of specifics, take to kind of change those systems?
Well, those systems of economic injustice, of course, do not just apply to Black people, but applies to white people very much as well. And we know that there are very specific policies that have been put in place and other policies that have been repealed over the last 40 years particularly that amounted to this systematic removal of massive amounts of wealth from the public treasury into the hands of a very, very few people. This has to do with subsidies. It has to do with tax cuts. It has to do with a repeal of Glass-Steagall. It has to do with failing to prosecute antitrust
Citizens United.
laws. Pardon?
Citizens United.
Citizens United, definitely. And that's what I mean when I talk about these systems that need to be addressed and fundamentally challenged. By the way, when you talked a few minutes ago about the fact that this is the largest wealth inequality since 1929, not every rich person is greedy, and not every poor person is noble and pure. And I do think there are a lot of very, very wealthy people in America who are deeply aware that this is a perilous path we're on. The capitalism at this point will create its own repudiation if it does not move back into some kind of ethical center. Now, even if it did that, though, we have the issue of the economic disparity having to do with Black America. And to me, what impacts me, the part that is essential as a white American and that I feel audiences really hear, has to do with the historical narrative. The fact that the 40 acres and a mule was promised, what that would have meant to a family of four, that a population which certainly had skill sets because they'd been slaves, they'd been forced laborers, what it would have meant to have 40 acres and a mule, how that would have allowed for integration economically, what the code laws did, Black code laws did, how it ensured a subpar opportunity socially, politically, and economically. So then when I walk that through with people, and then people understand, well, what did the Civil Rights Act do, and what did the Voting Rights Act do? And understand that the dismantling of many of the external aspects of segregation was achieved with the Civil Rights Act, and that with the Voting Rights Act, which, however, we have started chipping away at, which is why you have all these voter suppression efforts, and successful ones, by the way. But in 1965, the Voting Rights Act would then assure freedom at the polls. However, and I think this would have been different had King lived, and I think it would have been different had Nixon not won the election. But we just never, I don't want to minimize the struggles or the sacrifices or the successes of your ancestors or mine. But we have to see, what did they do? Because they did a lot. But what was left undone? And that was the major economic piece, which they simply hadn't gotten to. And which then, with benign neglect, which was promulgated by Nixon, it's simply something that was never done. And the gap has remained and grown.
Let's make sure that we understand slavery as an institution. We all, going back to what you said, got undertold the story. We didn't get told the story correctly. You know, slavery wasn't a Southern institution; it was an American institution. All of the banks that owned the notes on those big plantations, they were in the North. All the clothes were made in the North. All the clothes were made in the North. All of the cotton was transshipped from the North to England. I think that one of the lies that we tell ourselves is that it was a purely a Southern institution when it was the undergirding of the nation. Now, I continue by saying one of the next things that we don't deal with is the transition of blackness. And we've talked about this here on this show. We move from a system where black bodies hold basically the keynotes to American wealth to a system in redlining where black bodies are a contagion to wealth itself. So when blacks own themselves and are autonomous, they basically destroy wealth. But when blacks are owned by white people, they are the most expensive thing you can possibly own. By that, I mean a slave, when they had 3 years of field training, was worth more than a house. One slave. And I continue this on by saying we built this nation in a way where, as Darity shows, 40 acres and he shows us in the paper, 40 acres and a mule in the 21st century. It literally could it communicates out to about $400,000 a recipient if you do the math. That's his accounting. Yeah. But the interesting part is we forget the mule, and I think the mule was really important in message, because one of the ways you tricked and cheated black people was by overcharging them for the tool to actually be American. We see that now today in schooling and education, and we see black students unable to pay student debt. That they went out and got these educations, they can't plug it anywhere. So I ask you also, what are your thoughts about HBCUs, and do you have any specific?
What is HBCU?
Historically black colleges.
Well, I would ask you for the most informed information on that. That's a good thing, isn't it? Am I wrong? I would ask you, is that a good thing? Isn't it a good thing?
Yeah, it's a good thing to ask me, but at the same...
I mean, aren't historically black colleges, I mean, I would assume that when they were set up, maybe they were not with the best of intention, because they might have come from a consciousness of segregation at that time. Mm-hmm. But isn't it, I mean, I think that there are Jewish universities, and so why shouldn't there be black universities, women's universities, if that's what people choose? Yeah, what am I missing?
But at the same time, I'm saying, Yvette, you want to speak to endowment amounts and what HBCUs are going through?
Well, one of the things that we face is Antonio and I always talk about the cost of slavery, and the cost of slavery is kind of still available. Just like the cost of slavery, the fruit of that is so much in white life and white privilege. The cost is buried here. So what you see in terms of endowments of historically black colleges that produce more black doctors, that produce more black teachers, much more than regular universities, what you see is that they don't have endowments. So we just saw Bennett College. They still didn't get their accreditation. They raised $5 million in a short period of time because they needed to, and they still didn't get accreditation. And so that poverty that has been left in the system because of slavery has meant that our HBCUs are underfunded and in danger of closing. And so one of the things that Antonio and I have put in terms of our agenda is federal money, because the Howard University now gets money from the federal government, the federal charter, federal money to shore up HBCUs, because we don't get the money that was given to Johns Hopkins by what's the guy?
Private donors. Private donors.
But the former mayor of New York, right? We don't get those kind of billion-dollar, multi-million-dollar donations, because we are not a multi-million-dollar group. So I think what Antonio was going to is how do you shore up those groups, shore up those schools, and in general, what we, in terms of what kind of endowments that we need to have going forward and paying for that, and how do you do that?
Yeah. Have you thought about that?
Well, I do know this. I do know that in different cultural groups, there are the habits versus some that do not so much have the habits, whereby people who have made it into a better condition do not forget those who have not yet made it. That's one of the reasons why I feel people like Colin Kaepernick are very touching. These men who have made it as very successful athletes, but refuse to simply look away from the people who have not been as fortunate or as talented as they, and make a statement. But I also think that is true, should be true, and I hope is true financially. You have a lot of black wealth in this country. You have black billionaires. And so I hope that there is also the cultural habit among black wealth of supporting these colleges. You would know much more than I, but whether or not there is. But I do know there's a lot of black wealth in America.
See, and that's the pushback is that's the I think there's a certain presumption of an existence of a black wealth class that really doesn't exist. I just did the data with Matt Brunig. There's less than 300,000 black families that break $1 million, and they're largely at $1 and $1.2 million. I did an interview with one of the black billionaires, Byron Allen, and literally what he states is that, you know, we have black billionaires, but then we got real white billionaires. When I say a billionaire, I'm talking about a family that's worth $3 billion hard, $1 billion liquid. We have people like Oprah who have their money tied in certain things, but then you don't know if they really have liquid money that they can give to an institution. And I say all that to say we see that with our HBCUs. Literally, you had Bennett College unable to find a person that could just bless them with money versus Simmons College, the last HBCU, a single white man, not a billionaire, a single white man was able to give $4 million. I think that one of the problems of black celebrity, black entertainment, is it's created a false narrative that we have a wealth class of black people that don't exist by the data. And I think that what it's done as a result is it's created also a belief in white America that black people are choosing not to actually activate that money.
Well, I'm not going there, and nor do I think it's only the job of black wealth to address the issue that you're talking about. I think that's America's job. And I would dispute the idea that there aren't black billionaires because I've met a few of them.
No, I'm not saying
and that they can't make their cash liquid. Come on, Antonio.
No. I'm saying that there's only to get in the top 5% of black families, you only need 350 hard. I think one of the great failures of America is that it hasn't really told. You talked about history. It hasn't told the reality of the present. It hasn't told white America you have almost all the wealth. And when I say that, I mean when you look at it as a pie. White America has 90% of America's household wealth. Black America has 2.6. Now, I'm not saying that 2.6 it can't be used in some kind of way to undergird government to play at the top level of what government needs to do to support institutions. But what I'm saying is that I think that we treat it as though Black America has the true 13% of the wealth to represent their population when they don't. So like fundamentally these institutions from the black church to the black school to the black family, they need government in a wholly different way.
That's why, I mean, obviously that's why we're here talking about reparations. I mean, obviously I agree with that.
Yeah. Would you add anything, Yvette?
No, I think we need to be very careful when we discuss black. People, when you discuss Oprah, that's not the same thing as like there are other quote unquote black billionaires in Nigeria who are oil barons who don't have a history of slavery. And I think we just have to be very careful not to group these black people together because we all have different heritages and different lineages. And just be very careful about like the black billionaires that you meet. Part of the reason that's skewed is because sometimes they're not here. They don't have this kind of cost baked into their background, but they still have the same type of physical presentation, and we tend to just group them all together, but it's not American descendants of slaves or descendants of chattel slavery in this country. And
that leads me right into like this third question. I thank you so much for coming on today on such short notice. I know you have a speaking engagement this afternoon. I don't know if you're familiar with ADOS. It's been a big discussion. We've been pushing candidates to deal with lineage over color. And it's caused this whole question around blackness when we're not talking about whether somebody is globally like black in terms of that concept. We're talking about, are you an American descendant of slavery? And if you don't have that discussion, I don't believe you can get to reparations. Because if it happened now, reparations would be given to any black person. It would be given to any Nigerian, any Caribbean. It wouldn't even be disseminated correctly. Would you agree with that?
I totally agree with you.
Okay. And
America doesn't owe... Yeah, I understand. I understand who America owes to versus who America does not owe to.
Yeah, and so we see that both with the transition from a Barack Obama to a Kamala Harris. Barack Obama being half Kenyan, half white, and then labeled as the first African-American president, which I believe he's the first black president, but he's not the first African-American president. African-American as a term is really something that has a significant flaw. It's a continent and a country. Africa's not a country. It's a continent with 54 very diverse countries. And so like what you get is this dynamic of a term that was created for the progeny of American slavery. used to normalize people that aren't African American. They know they're not African American at home. They're Kenyan American or Jamaican American or Nigerian American, or for that matter, they're just Nigerian. And you have Kamala on the other side, who now is basically a Brahmin Indian on one side, which is the most elite Indian, and on the other side, she is Jamaican. And it's, Jamaica also has non-black Jamaicans, but she's Jamaican. She does not descend from American slavery. And I guess I'm just asking if you're familiar with us, and also did you get a chance to see our Black agenda? Because it kind of lays out a definite specificity around everything from infrastructure to schooling to healthcare to even reparations, just the beginning of a discussion.
I am familiar with the term. I'm familiar with the material that you sent me. And the conversation that I am most interested about as a candidate and would be as president is how to then operationalize all this. And when it comes to certain issues of housing and certain other systemic issues of obviously racist prejudice, the question becomes how much of that actually fundamentally repairs the basic error. Because, and I was mentioning to you before about how a former pope used the expression purification of memory, that with a prayer, until you have made a full-on apology and a full-on atonement, then you remain unconscious of ways that you continue to perpetrate the problem. So the reason I find reparations a particularly important piece of all this is because it acknowledges that a wrong was done. If we only talk about disparity in housing or disparity in education or disparity in whatever, then it could be argued that all we are doing is addressing the gap. The reason I think reparations has moral and psychological significance is because it is inherently an acknowledgement of a debt to be paid. It is inherently an acknowledgement of a wrong that was done and a wrong that must be made right. Now, I understand that then gets complicated. I totally understand that if you and I were sitting down at the table and saying, okay, how are we going to do this? I totally understand that you might say to me, well, we got to be careful here, because then if you don't have enough for reparations, and then we have a bunch of white people saying, we gave you enough, we gave you reparations. I understand that it gets complicated, but I have felt for myself as a candidate, and even way before I was a candidate, when I was talking about reparations 30 years ago in my book, Healing the Soul of America, that there is something, just as the Germans paid reparations to the Jews, $89 billion since World War II. And I know that has been a large part of the emotional and psychological reconciliation, not just economic reconciliation, between Germany and the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe. And when I read about how Ronald Reagan in 1988 signed the American Civil Liberties Act, which gave to surviving prisoners, the prisoners who had been interned in the Japanese internment camps, and we gave them reparations, it has always felt to me, why haven't we given reparations? Now, I understand it's a multidimensional problem. And I understand even on those economic issues, it gets kind of gnarly. Well, if you do this, and you're not going to do that, et cetera. However, on a moral level, which is where this country most needs healing, if we don't have this moral and spiritual awakening, then nothing we do on the outside is going to be enough. And that's why the subject of reparations, even to put it on the table, to make the case for the moral need for America to do this, is what will release, I believe, great healing potential for our children, your children and mine.
But it is your view on reparations more about the healing of the nation or repairing Black people, or is that the same for you?
To me, it's funny. White America needs it as much as Black people need it. On an economic level, I understand that Black people need it, but on a spiritual level, white people need it too. This is a place where we are, where we have a national character defect that must be addressed. And so to me, my interest in this is my interest in the healing of America. It's not some, it's an injustice. It's an economic injustice. So, and the economic injustice in this particular instance is perpetrated against Black people. Now, there are other areas of with Native Americans or whatever. There are many areas of injustice that must be addressed. But in terms of America moving forward, This is something that is keeping all of us back, I believe, until we address it in a fundamental way.
Yvette, one thing I wanted you to speak to is can you speak to how those things in our agenda are actually components of how we see reparations being actually released and actually.
Well, everything in our agenda, when we talk about mass incarceration, when we talk about historically black colleges, when we even talk about lineage therapy in terms of what has to happen and what is, and what we have to deal with in a very specific way. These are very specific things in terms of, the cost is expressed of slavery and redlining and Reconstruction and benign neglect of not just Republicans but the Democratic Party as well. We talked about how all of that expresses itself in the racial wealth gap, and I just want to be clear about one thing. There are a lot of abused and disenfranchised groups in America. I think we can all agree on that. But there's only one group, and I like to have specificity here because I don't want us to talk about American DOS in terms of just people of color.
Yeah.
There's only one group that built this country with chattel slavery, right? And unsustained and unrelenting oppression for 400 years. So I'd like to have a very specific conversation about that group, not because you did this, but I'm saying that I don't want us to get caught up in this area where, there's something that white people tend to do by throwing us all in this people of color.
No, I'm with you. I would feel the same way. I totally understand that, and I have spoken to that publicly. I hope you know. Listen, guys, if the miracle, people say you're such a long shot, and I say, well, Trump is president. If I am ever president of the United States, I invite you now. We're going to have a weekend at Camp David, and I invite both of you, and we will decide who should be invited. And I look forward to really talking this through from early in the morning to late in the evening and really getting down. And it thrills me as an American to think that there would be an American president who would say, let's sit down, let's have this conversation, let's do this. Let's take every little piece, let's talk it out, and come up with something beautiful for America. That's It thrills me to think that day could happen. And for that matter, whether it was me or anyone else. But if it's me, the invite is there.
And let me say something. We have a conference October 4th in Louisville, Kentucky, the ADOS conference. We'd like to invite you to come out and be part of that conference and possibly speak to the audience. We definitely look forward to having 1,000, if not more, people in the audience and hear from you and any other presidential candidates about your campaign and your policy promises to Black America specifically. And let me say, I also appreciate you tabling reparations in the middle, throwing it into the middle of this discussion as it needed to be. And now everybody's talking about it. Now, I'm not saying that you yourself are the individual cause of that. That's as a result of all the people that are in my chat, all the people on Twitter using ADOS, Yvette, Carnell, myself, Sandy Darity, Tariq Nasheed, so many other people that have been pushing to make sure that this discussion gets tabled. But you definitely caused quite a storm when you announced and said that I want to make sure that reparations is given, even though the amount was low.
Okay.
So you're gonna get tagged for that. So let me say this: we've recently, as we move towards the end of this, we ourselves, ADOS, has recently dealt with something that was covered by The Intercept over there. They do great work, and this accusation of Russian bots. We're gonna do some McCarthyism. Dr. King dealt with this with the Montgomery bus boycott. This minimalization of your voice because it doesn't fit the narrative of what we need to be said. Have you experienced that? And also, can you relate to what we've been going through if you're familiar at all?
Well, the ego mind is very sly. And sometimes there is externalized oppression, injustice, and unfairness, such as you're describing with bots. But the deeper injustice is in our minds. So what I see with my own candidacy, for instance, I'm not as so worried about Russian bots as I'm worried about a mainstream viewpoint that has the audacity to say that only a certain kind of experience and a certain kind of political establishment cred is enough to be seriously considered for president. That's in our minds. So where I feel none of this would hold the power to hold us back, whether it's bots or attitudes, is if there's enough activation within us. You know, Martin Luther King said there's a power in us greater than the power of bullets. There's a power in us greater than the power of bots. There's a power in us greater than the power of narrow-minded thinking. And I believe that it's been the slumber of the American spirit that is most needs to be addressed right now. And that's why conversations like this matter to me. They're all just part of an awakening. You know, whether you're a nation or an individual, you awaken one aha at a time.
Man, Yvette, look, is there anything you want to ask as we start moving towards the end of this discussion, specifically to Miss Williamson?
Well, no, I don't think there's anything I want to ask, but you know, I think I don't want to be too forward, but I would give a word of caution and a word of advice, I guess I would call it. You know, Antonio and I have had to learn a lot, and we have had to do a lot of research, and not even any of the other candidates are doing. And you know, you see that from Kamala Harris' interview with the Breakfast Club. You see that from the people who interviewed her at the Breakfast Club. And so I would tell you that the thing that is going to insulate you from some of the attacks that you are going to endure going forward is to have the data. And that's
Is to what? I'm sorry?
Have the data. Have the data.
Well, if there's data that I need that I do not have, I hope that you will show it to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's, you know, that's our role, Sandy Darity, Dark Hamilton, all of the great researchers that are out there. And I think that one of the things that's going on right now is that we weren't told what America was appropriately. I mean, historically, and then also present day, we were told that America is much more fair and much more open and much more like equitable than it is.
Well, we aspire to be, and the fact that there is such a gap between the principles on which we purport to stand and certain areas such as race where we are not living those principles, it seems to me is the job of every generation. It's our job to close that gap, and that's what I think everybody on this call wants to do.
Any last thing you want to say to the Tone Talks audience and the Dash Radio audience out there?
Just thank you for having me, and I look forward to further conversation, and I look forward to the day. I will be honored if that day comes when we can really get down and make something happen.
And there was something else you were trying to have done because you're trying to get to the debate stage. Anything you want to tell to the...
Thank you very, very much. Yes, the DNC rules say that in order for me to make it into the debates, I have to have 65,000 individual contributors, as well as at least 200 from 20 states. I have at least 200 from 15 states. But so I'm feeling pretty good about getting to that. But that issue of small contributors, even if someone gives $2, then that counts as a contributor. So if anybody feels that my campaign and my candidacy is, you want to see this on the debate stage, then I hope that people will go to Marianne2020.com and donate as they see fit.
And Yvette Carnell, where can they find you?
Mondays and Wednesdays, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, YouTube, Breaking Brown Live. And I want to thank Ms. Williamson for just coming on, having this conversation, because this is a conversation that needs to happen. It's going to be a long road, but I appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you.
And this is Antonio Moore Tone Talks. I'll be back on at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time today. My regular time, I'll have Dr. Tommy Curry on, and we're going to have a great discussion about Jussie Smollett. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you guys soon.